Welcome to Beyond the Divide, where understanding runs deeper than agreement. Today, we delve into the complex and often contentious realm of international diplomacy by scrutinizing President Trump's approach to the Russia-Ukraine war. This episode will navigate the intricate balance between idealism and pragmatism in foreign policy. While some argue that Trump's transactional diplomacy has yielded tangible results, such as partial ceasefires and resource agreements, others caution that it may embolden aggression and compromise Ukraine's sovereignty. These differing perspectives highlight a broader debate on how America should engage with the world and the potential repercussions for global security and the international system. Is a pragmatic, deal-oriented strategy the way forward? Or does it risk undermining long-held ideals and international norms? Guiding us through this thought-provoking discussion are our AI-powered fictional panelists, Sara and Yakov Lasker. Known for their well-balanced and respectful discourse, Sara and Yakov will unpack these issues from multiple angles, aiming to deepen our understanding rather than simply reach agreement. So, without further ado, let's start.
Hello and welcome to today's discussion. I'm Sara, and as always, I'm joined by my friend and favorite sparring partner, Yakov Lasker. How are you doing today, Yakov?
I'm great, Sara. Thanks for asking. And I'm excited to dive into today's topic, President Trump's handling of the Russia-Ukraine war since taking office in January.
Lay it on me, Yakov. This is certainly a topic that's been dominating headlines these past few months. Whether you supported Trump during the election or not, his approach to this conflict represents a major shift in American foreign policy that affects not just Ukraine and Russia, but potentially the entire global order.
Exactly. The core question we're wrestling with today is whether Trump's diplomatic gambit and pressure tactics are finally bringing this bloody conflict to a close, or if his approach amounts to abandoning Ukraine and rewarding Russian aggression in ways that could destabilize international security for decades to come.
You know, what fascinates me about this whole situation is how quickly things changed after the inauguration. By late February, Trump had already invited Zelensky to Washington, initiated high-level talks with Putin, and started pushing both sides toward a peace deal. That's a stark contrast to the previous administration, which hadn't spoken directly with Putin in 2 years.
But that fast pace came with serious costs. That February 28th meeting between Trump, Vance, and Zelensky in the Oval Office was a diplomatic disaster. What was supposed to be a signing ceremony for a U.S.-Ukraine security and mineral rights agreement turned into what witnesses described as a fiery confrontation. When Zelensky hesitated to sign an agreement giving the U.S. unprecedented control over Ukraine's rare earth minerals, Trump immediately suspended all military aid.
I think we need to put this in context. Trump was elected partly on his promise to end this war quickly. Remember his claim that he could do it in 24 hours? While that was obviously campaign rhetoric, he's been consistent about his strategy. He believes the U.S. has spent too much, around $350 billion compared to Europe's $100 billion, with no security, with no anything to show for it. The aid freeze was a negotiating tactic, plain and simple.
A negotiating tactic that puts Ukrainian lives at risk, when Trump warned that if somebody doesn't want to make a deal, that person won't be around very long. He was essentially threatening Zelensky's position. And let's be absolutely clear about who the aggressor is here. Russia invaded a sovereign nation unprovoked. When Trump uses language like, "they're killing each other," he's creating a false equivalence that legitimizes war crimes.
I don't think anyone disputes that Russia was wrong to invade. But the question now is, what can actually be achieved? Secretary Rubio and numerous military analysts have acknowledged that this conflict cannot be resolved militarily. The front lines have barely moved in the past year, despite massive Western support. At some point, we have to face reality rather than wishful thinking, and reality is that Crimea is gone. NATO membership for Ukraine is a fantasy, and Russia's economy can sustain this war for several more years despite sanctions.
That's where I strongly disagree. Ukrainian counteroffensives have proven that with sufficient equipment, Patriots, ATAC-MS, F-16s, and ammunition, Russia can be pushed back. The problem has been that Western support has been incremental and hesitant, never providing enough at the right time to allow Ukraine to gain decisive momentum. If we had supplied everything Ukraine needed from the beginning instead of worrying about Russian red lines, we might not be in this position.
But that approach risks direct confrontation with a nuclear power. Every day the U.S. stays deeply involved, it risks wider war or nuclear escalation for zero strategic gain. And let's be honest about Congress. There is 0.0 chance of another large Ukraine package being approved. The American public is exhausted by this conflict. A recent poll showed 68% of Americans believe we're spending too much on Ukraine when we have pressing needs at home.
That's because the administration has failed to articulate why this matters to Americans. This isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the entire post-1945 international order that prohibits territorial conquest. If Russia succeeds, we're sending a message to every potential aggressor worldwide that might makes right. U.S. credibility is at stake. If Washington wavers now, allies everywhere from the Baltic states to East Asia will doubt every future security guarantee.
I understand that argument, but it assumes that more American money will actually prevent that outcome. Let's look at what Trump has achieved. By mid-March, he had brokered a partial ceasefire focusing on energy infrastructure. After his 90-minute call with Putin on March 18th, Russia agreed to halt attacks on Ukrainian power grids and utilities, and Ukraine agreed in principle to a 30-day interim ceasefire. That's tangible progress.
But it falls far short of what's needed. Putin declined to endorse a full 30-day ceasefire, citing concerns that Ukraine might use a pause to rearm. What Trump is offering is essentially a temporary pause that benefits Russia by allowing them to consolidate gains. And let's talk about Trump's minerals for aid deal. This arrangement would give the U.S. unprecedented control over Ukraine's natural resources via a joint investment fund. Trump literally said he wants to recoup some of the aid provided to Ukraine. That's not diplomacy, it's exploitation.
Trump is simply being transparent about what many world leaders think but don't say, that foreign policy should advance concrete national interests. He campaigned on putting America first, and he's delivering on that promise. The minerals deal is actually a good agreement that creates mutual benefits for both countries. Ukraine gains security partnerships and investment, while America secures strategic resources. This is smart diplomacy that creates lasting partnerships. I actually find his honesty refreshing compared to the typical diplomatic doublespeak.
There's a difference between advancing national interests and taking advantage of a vulnerable ally. When Trump says about Zelensky, he's trying to back out of the rare earth deal, and if he does that, he's got some problems. Big problems. That sounds more like a mafia boss than a president. And his statement that under his presidency, Ukraine will never going to be a member of NATO is unilaterally deciding Ukraine's future without their input.
Let's be realistic, though. Ukraine's NATO membership was never going to happen in the foreseeable future. Germany and France were already blocking it before the war started. Trump is just acknowledging the reality that other Western leaders won't admit publicly. And regarding the minerals deal, Zelensky himself wrote in a letter to Trump that Ukraine was ready to sign an agreement on minerals and security at any time convenient for you. That suggests Ukraine sees value in the arrangement.
Under extreme duress? Yes. Meanwhile, Trump's actions on sanctions are equally troubling. After his call with Putin, the White House spoke of plans to expand trade with Russia, and Trump mentioned gaining access to very big forms of rare earth from Russia. He's looking for economic deals with Moscow when we should be tightening sanctions, secondary measures on banks and oil traders, full SWIFT cutoffs, tighter tech export bans, and stopping Russian crude sold via India. We haven't exhausted economic pressure by any means.
The sanctions were never as effective as we hoped. Russia's economy has proven surprisingly resilient, and with China, India, and even European countries continuing to buy Russian energy, the impact has been blunted. Europe criticizes Trump's approach while simultaneously buying Russian oil and gas. That hypocrisy is exactly why Trump is pushing for Europe to step up, maybe a lot more, and take greater responsibility for a conflict in their backyard.
If we're talking about hypocrisy, let's discuss Trump's humanitarian policies. The 90-day foreign aid freeze he ordered on day one, the 83% cut to USAID's budget, and the potential revocation of protected status for some 240,000 Ukrainian refugees in the US. These aren't strategic decisions. They're punitive measures that hurt civilians. The UN had to scale back its humanitarian targets for Ukraine, from helping 6 million people to just 4.8 million, due largely to these US funding cuts.
I wouldn't characterize them as punitive so much as reflective of different priorities. Trump has consistently argued that America's resources should first benefit Americans. Every dollar spent abroad is a dollar not spent on American infrastructure, healthcare, or border security. And regarding refugees, the administration has indicated they're reviewing the program, not that they've made a final decision on deportations. Trump himself said, "We're not looking to hurt anybody."
Actions speak louder than words. His January 20th executive order already called for DHS to terminate all categorical parole programs, which includes Uniting for Ukraine. And I haven't even mentioned Trump's campaign promise to end the war in 24 hours, which has obviously failed. It was always a stunt, and its failure exposes his lack of a coherent strategy beyond pressuring the weaker party, Ukraine, to capitulate.
I actually think Trump deserves credit for trying where others failed. The phrase that comes to mind is a Russian saying, "Хотел как лучше, получилось как всегда." He wanted the best. But it turned out as always. He discovered what many analysts already knew. This problem is incredibly difficult, possibly insoluble in the near term. Instead of being honest about that, many critics are using Trump as a psychological voodoo doll. Hatred of him now eclipses condemnation of Putin in social media discourse.
That's a deflection from the real issue. Trump's approach is appeasement in plain sight. He flatters Putin, bullies Zelensky, and offers unilateral concessions. Exactly what failed historically with dictators and would fail here. A bad peace that ratifies annexations, leaves millions under occupation, normalizes ethnic cleansing, and virtually guarantees the Kremlin will attack again once it rearms. Putin won't stop with current territorial gains if successful.
I agree that Putin bears the greater moral responsibility here, but that doesn't change the practical impossibility of the situation. Moral posturing doesn't alter reality. There's a reason Trump's team has been floating ideas like land swaps, long-term leases for disputed territories, and international oversight of critical infrastructure. They're trying to find creative compromises where both sides get something they need. Perfect solutions aren't on the table.
That brings us to a fundamental difference in how we view this conflict. From my perspective, this represents a struggle between democratic self-determination and authoritarian aggression. When we push Ukraine to accept territorial losses or limit their future NATO aspirations, we're compromising on core American values about freedom and sovereignty. Recognizing Russian annexations legitimizes illegal conquest and sets a dangerous precedent for other territorial disputes worldwide.
I appreciate that framing, and I share those values. Where we differ is that I believe in pragmatism and recognizing limits. My concern comes from valuing American lives and resources, believing we shouldn't sacrifice them indefinitely in conflicts where our direct security isn't threatened. I'm also skeptical of open-ended commitments with unclear objectives. What exactly does victory look like here? No one seems able to define it concretely.
For Ukraine, victory means territorial integrity and security guarantees that prevent future Russian aggression. I understand the concern about limits and unclear objectives, but those are reasons to be more strategic in our support, not to withdraw it. What drives many of us on the more liberal side is a deep fear that appeasing aggression now only leads to greater aggression later. History, particularly from the 1930s, suggests that dictators who successfully use force will do so again, with escalating ambition.
That's a legitimate concern, and I don't dismiss historical parallels. My fear, though, is that we're caught in a false binary where the only options are total Ukrainian victory or total appeasement. There must be a middle path where Ukraine maintains independence and receives security guarantees, even if the final borders aren't ideal. Trump's approach, for all its flaws, is at least trying to find that middle path rather than continuing a status quo that costs lives daily.
I can acknowledge that we need to find a sustainable solution. Perhaps we can agree that any peace must include meaningful security for Ukraine, whether through formal alliances, international guarantees, or robust self-defense capabilities. No deal should leave them vulnerable to a repeat invasion once Russia regroups.
Absolutely, and I think we can also agree that European nations need to take greater responsibility, both financially and militarily, for security on their continent. Trump's pressure on NATO allies to increase defense spending isn't just about money. It's about creating a more balanced security partnership where America isn't always the primary security provider.
That's a point of common ground. I'd add that whatever settlement emerges should include a substantial international reconstruction package for Ukraine. If the US scales back direct military aid, perhaps those resources could be redirected toward helping rebuild civilian infrastructure, supporting refugees, and strengthening Ukraine's economy for the long term.
I like that approach. It's a more productive use of resources than perpetual weapons shipments, and it offers Ukrainians tangible hope for the future. It might also help address some of the refugee concerns if people believe they can eventually return to a stable, functioning homeland. And despite our differences on tactics, I think we both want Ukraine to thrive as a sovereign, democratic nation.
Agreed. And regardless of the final territorial arrangements, accountability for war crimes must remain non-negotiable. Any peace process that simply brushes aside documented atrocities would be morally bankrupt and set a terrible precedent for future conflicts.
I couldn't agree more on that point. Justice for victims should transcend politics. In fact, I think this entire discussion highlights something important. While we may disagree on Trump's specific tactics, most Americans across the political spectrum want to see a free, secure Ukraine and a stable Europe. The debate is primarily about means, not ends.
To summarize today's discussion, Trump's approach to the Russia-Ukraine war represents a dramatic shift in American foreign policy, prioritizing quick results, transactional diplomacy, and narrower definitions of U.S. interests. While this has produced some diplomatic momentum, serious questions remain about whether the terms of any peace will provide lasting security or merely set the stage for the future conflict. The stakes couldn't be higher, not just for Ukraine, but for the international system itself.
Thanks for that excellent recap, Yakov. As we close today, I'd like our listeners to consider: how do you balance idealism and pragmatism in your own approach to complex international issues? Can you acknowledge the legitimate concerns of those who see this conflict differently without questioning their values or intentions? That kind of nuanced engagement is exactly what we try to model here.
And we hope you'll join us next week for another episode of Beyond the Divide. Thanks for listening.
Until next time, this is Sara.
And Yakov Lasker, signing off. Take care, everyone. That brings us to the end of today's discussion, where we explored the complexities of President Trump's approach to the Russia-Ukraine war, balancing transactional diplomacy with the risks of undermining Ukraine's sovereignty. We hope you found value in understanding the tension between idealism and pragmatism in international relations. If so, please like, comment, and share this episode. Stay tuned for more perspectives on Beyond the Divide.